Okay, I'm here to talk about scaling VuFind 2. As I said, I'm Ben Mosier, and that's Ben Veens from the Keystone Library Network in Pennsylvania. We're talking about the challenges we faced when we increased our organizational complexity and how we dealt with managing a larger data set, specifically with VuFind. The Keystone Library Network is a network of 19 Pennsylvania institutions, and our Solr index comprises about 8.8 million records, which is a lot of fun to manage. And I just want to state a disclaimer here. While we're talking about the challenges we faced, there are certainly some things that probably aren't best practice. So this is more of an exploration of what we did to get to where we are now. And I'd be certainly interested in entertaining discussions with anybody over the next day or two to talk about how we did things wrong or what better things we can be doing in the future. So in a typical VuFind configuration, you have your institutions and you have your libraries. And what makes this a lot more complicated in the context of a consortium is that you have to manage numbers of institutions at any one time, and you have to make sure that they're provided with some sort of catalog interface, which is what VuFind is designed to do. And this is, at least from our perspective, what a typical configuration looks like. In the middle there you have the VuFind web server, looking up records in the Solr index, and then checking on things like status and patron logins in the ILS itself. And because we're a consortium, our requirements for VuFind were a little bit different. We need to both have a global catalog for everyone involved in the consortium, but we also need to be able to have individual customized catalogs that everybody can have just so. So those are our two challenges. And problem one was keeping records separate in Solr. It's a little bit difficult when you just queue up a bunch of records and it's just going to assign an ID automatically. And part of that has to do, we dealt with that by assigning prepending IDs, so institution-specific IDs to each individual record that gets imported. So I know that BLOO.12345 might be record 123345 from Bloomsburg University. So that was the easy part. The hard part is actually getting VuFind to talk to the ILS and do things for each individual ILS instance. Keystone Library Network currently uses the Voyager ILS, and it's a little bit fun trying to get everything to coordinate correctly, and this is where the multi-backend driver comes in. Originally developed by Era Mayala, I believe, and further by some of our own staff to fit into VuFind 2. We've been able to take advantage of the multi-backend driver to actually accommodate this exact scenario with the consortium. So for every single record that's looked up in VuFind, it can go through, figure out which institution it belongs to, and get a status update on it, or patron logins and that sort of thing as well. So in other words, our global catalog problem is solved. We can get to any of the ILS records from our global catalog that we have installed. But that doesn't really answer the question of what we're supposed to do about the individual catalog. So, assuming we already have VuFind installed, and we have this global catalog, and all our records are imported, and they're delineated by specific IDs per institution, now we need to start talking about how do we build a custom interface for each institution. And I definitely have to give credit where credit is due. Damien Katz and everybody else on the mailing list they've definitely been very helpful with us as we've gone through this process. Both developing new features and working with us on existing configuration possibilities. So I'm sorry if this gets a little bit technical. I'm kind of going a little bit deep because I'm hoping that perhaps I can form some documentation that's usable for other institutions, and it's a little bit specific. So our requirements were that we had to have a completely customizable VuFind interface without actually installing X number of VuFind instances. So that includes specific URLs, host names, very specific theming, custom facets. Some of our institutions use Dewey instead of the Library of Congress standards for call numbers. And so it gets kind of interesting getting all that into perspective. So we start out, we have, and this is a DNS record, we have our vf.klnp.org. That is our global instance. Now we also have what we've created, vf-ship. So this is Shippensburg University's VuFind interface underneath the Keystone Library Network. And we're pointing it at the global catalog IP. It's the same IP address same host. So we're going to take advantage of a situation where we only want to use one machine, one host, one IP address to host all of this information. And that doesn't matter so much. This configuration is what matters the most. So this is our Apache configuration, and it's obviously going to be a lot different for a Windows environment, unless they're also running Apache. But the important part here is that we're listening with a server name, vf-ship.klmpa.org. So any request that comes in for vf-ship.klmpa.org is going to be forwarded through this virtual host. And the include there, I have vfpath as sort of a generic placeholder there, but this is going to be the custom locations for our individual overrides, our individual implementations for each institution. So this is our vfpath/ship, and then there's our custom Apache configuration specifically for Shippensburg University. And this, I've definitely snipped out a whole bunch of other important bits, but any standard installation, any standard Apache configuration for VuFind will have a whole bunch of information in it about where to find themes and things like that. But the important part here for our purposes is that we have a little note here that says, if the host is vf-ship.klmpa.org, set the VuFind local directory to our custom VF path and to our local override. So there's a lot of information that I'm throwing at you, but I'm hoping that I can sort of meander you through this path and get you to the point where you see where this is all coming together. So next we're going to talk about configuration overrides. And the beautiful thing about the VuFind local instance is that any configuration with the name, for instance, config.ini, is going to override any previously set configuration. So we have a really cut and dry here. We have one section, site, URL equals vf-ship.klmpa.org, and theme equals kln-ship. And as I imagine you can probably guess, that is the Shippensburg University theme override. It is the specific theme we put together for Shippensburg University. And underneath here is one of the most important and cool things about the way VuFind 2 works. It's the parent configuration. And what we have here is essentially a link back to a global configuration that contains settings that apply to multiples of institutions. So in this case, I have vfpath/default. So this is going to be a configuration from our default configuration for everything. So these would have things like English as the primary language because we're a Pennsylvania institution. It would have information like the Solr backend or what synthetic sort of thumbnail configurations we're using. So that's what's going to be in that file there. Another example is going to be the searches.ini, and this is actually important to point out because in order to have an individual instance, we need to make sure we hide all other records from that individual instance's view. So here we have a hidden filter for the institution of Shippensburg University, and a parent config that has a host of other configurations that apply to all other institutions. So if this were a different institution like Bloomsburg University's, it would look exactly the same, except it would say institution equals Bloomsburg University as the hidden filter. Alright, so this takes care of our individual catalog, at least at some base level. And just to give you a quick demonstration here, this is, hopefully if it loads, an individual override of our VuFind catalog. This is branded for Shippensburg University, has Shippensburg University settings, and it's completely configurable for Shippensburg University because of the way we did those configuration files. If I were to, for example, go back to the global catalog, we would see something completely different. Here on the left you can see that we're looking at a global view. State Library of Pennsylvania is the first thing, Westchester, ordered by number of results for a blank search. And we can see a whole bunch of interesting things there for different institutions. So there are a lot of results for Bloomsburg University at the top there. One last example here of what we have. State Library of Pennsylvania is actually using VuFind as a primary catalog now. So that's really good news for us, and it's a lot of fun to sort of see them grow and face the same kinds of challenges that we've already been facing. And as you can see, one of the interesting things here is that we have them using the Dewey Decimal System for call numbers instead of LC. So that's kind of a quick little perspective into that. Let's see if my laptop doesn't go to sleep. Okay. So next we're going to talk about scaling Solr. Solr is the record backend for VuFind in the default case, and in our case we have 8.8 million records or so, and this ends up being about 23 gigabytes worth of data on the disk. Now this is a little bit alarming because we have exactly one copy of the data on one machine, and it's a little bit concerning. If something were to happen that ever would corrupt that data, we would have an issue. And because of the state library specifically, the PA state library specifically wanting to use VuFind primarily, we needed to make sure that we would be able to have a reliable situation where if, for instance, the Solr index would be corrupted for one reason or another, we would be able to rebuild quickly, or at least have them in such a case where it's highly available and they wouldn't notice any difference about it being down or anything like that. So along that line, we also were encountering the issue where direct writing for importing data seemed to be the most effective method for us, and unfortunately that means the index has to be turned off. And so while it's importing data, nobody can make any query calls. So this puts a lot of constraints on us. How are we going to accommodate this? And on top of that, there are a bunch of other restrictions here. We need frequent updates. It's not sufficient anymore to update things overnight. People want to import records, see them in VuFind within a few hours. And I've mentioned the high availability a little bit, but we also want to accommodate high traffic volumes because the State Library of Pennsylvania services all of Pennsylvania. So I began an exploration into Solr. Solr 4 and VuFind 2 is a new wonderful thing. And I thought, okay, well, let's take a look at this beautiful thing called the Solr Cloud, which is the official Solr 4 high availability replication solution here. And there's an address down there. It's a little bit long, but you can read up on the Solr Cloud if you'd like. And basically the way it works is that you have a zookeeper, which is essentially the master of all of your instances, and it controls how things are replicated and copied. And there are interesting little concepts like leader elections and that sort of thing. So you can have X number of Solr servers up and running, and they're talking to each other and working together. And I sort of got one working, and unfortunately this is one of those things where I got to a point where I was just frustrated reading the documentation. I decided I needed to either start over or look at another solution. And that could be my fault, or it could just be that I need to wait a little bit until this feature matures and has sufficient documentation and it's been done before. A lot of us are busy, so that's the sort of thing that we all kind of have to deal with. So I took a look at another solution that seemed to be a little bit more reliable. And I wanted to just go back to the old style master-slave replication that was offered in previous versions of Solr. So I set up a primary Solr instance, Solr 0, set it to be the master, and that was going to be my index box. And so any indexing I had to do, anytime I had to take down the database, Solr 0 would run all the indexing. Meanwhile, Solr 1 was the slave. It would be consistently polling for new updates from the master, but it would be serving all the VuFind queries. So while we're indexing, the Solr slave is serving the queries, so nobody sees any downtime, and we can still run updates as often as we can feasibly run them. So in this case, we're running them 4 or 5 times a day without anybody noticing that there's a problem. So how this is accomplished is actually pretty simple. I tried a couple of different complicated options at first, but then I realized that other people will want to use this. So I started out with a stock VuFind install, and I just saw what I could do to actually get us back to the same state. And it turns out all I had to do is go to the Solr Biblio directory underneath the VuFind default directory, look in the conf, and edit the solr config.xml. And fortunately, it's actually not that difficult. It's a little snippet of code, and I'm going to make sure, I promise, to document this somewhere public so that we all can find this later. But there's a little snippet of code here that basically sets up a replication handler, and for the master, you set what you're going to replicate, and you set when you're going to replicate. And then if it's a slave, you actually set the master URL, which in this case would have been Solr 0, and the poll interval, so that it'll know how often to check to see if anything is updated. So that wasn't too bad. It seemed pretty simple, a little too simple at first, so I was a little confused that it was that easy. But Little did I know, that was all it had to do to actually pull new information. So with this information, I realized I could just create new Solr instances, just spin them up right away and not have any issues whatsoever. 23 gigabytes inside the same data center takes a lot less time to transfer and update than it does to import all those records again through the normal import process for VuFind. So that was exciting. And the other thing too is that for dev environments, if all I need to do is set up a development server and I just want to use the same index that I have, I can just point it back at this, or I can set up a completely independent copy of the same instance of data. So I can actually orphan off a slave and just let it sort of live independently and doesn't have to necessarily receive updates all the time. But the amount of setup time it took to actually do that was all just copying and pasting some configuration into a file and letting it run. So that was really exciting to discover. So of course I wasn't done, so I took it a little bit farther. And so real quick before I get to that point, this is just an interface of the Solr, I guess the configuration interface, and you can see that it's talking about replication. The next run set in 23 seconds, and that would be counting down constantly. And while we're on this information, you can see that there was a red thing there. It says failure Friday, October 11th. And then above that, a check mark, success Monday, October 14th. And I know for a fact that on Friday, October 11th at 5:05 p.m., the master server was indexing. It was down, so it couldn't pull a new replication. So it's kind of neat to see all that just sort of there. Also, that interface tells you some neat things like which version your master and slave are on. It's good to tell if something's off. Their versions will be different if they haven't replicated yet, or if something is broken. And you can also see how big your index is. So that's kind of neat. So I had to take it a little bit farther. And this is more or less accomplishing the same thing as the Solr cloud, but going a little bit of a different route. And HAProxy is basically an open source load balancing solution. And what that is it'll take one input, so in this case vufind.klnp.org, port 8080 or something like that, and it will actually balance where it sends those queries, sends those requests among different servers that we set up. So down here, and I know it's sort of hard to see, it's not helping at all, but these two green lines here are my two slave servers. So at this point I've spun up another slave server and I have it just sitting there serving queries. With the HAProxy statistics interface, I can see that they've been serving about the same amount of data because they've been given the same priority back and forth. And down here I see in blue I have set up Solr 1, which is in this, the nomenclature is a little bit different because of different environments, but in this case, Solr 1 is the master server, whereas Solr 0 and 2 are the slaves. Don't ask me why. But Solr 1 is set as a backup, so if for any reason the two slaves would go down or become inaccessible, it would actually resort to using the backup. So that's kind of a nice little redundancy there. So I've achieved something of high availability as long as the VuFind server is up and as long as the HAProxy system is running. Things should be more or less highly available. And those two things are least prone to failure. If anything, it's always the Solr index that crashes whenever we say VuFind crashes. So that's really interesting to look at. And of course, I'm going to have to show you all the gory details here. It's another configuration file specifically for HAProxy. And here we have one server, another server. They're given a weight of 256, both of them. And then so that they'll be balanced evenly, and then we have underneath that another server defined, which is our index server, and is set as a backup. And of course, the cool thing about this is that you can tell it to perform a test query, and depending on what kind of result it gets, it'll know whether a Solr instance is up or down. So lots of flexibility here, lots of cool stuff, and I'm not done. So one of the cool things you can do on top of HAProxy is you can actually set up SNMP monitoring, and using anything like Cacti or Nagios or Zabbix or anything else that's compatible with SNMP, you can actually just poll for data, see how many servers are up, and you'll be able to tell whether or not your system is down. You'll be able to get alerts whenever a Solr index crashes or something like that, if that were to happen. And you can always tell whether or not your master Solr index is indexing because it'll be down. if you can set something like if your master index is down for more than 15 minutes, maybe something is going wrong. Maybe there's some record input that is incorrect, and you have to go check on that. So there's a lot of flexibility here, and I know not all of it is immediately apparent as how to connect those dots, but I promise if anybody asks me in person or on the mailing list, I will do my best to respond and sort of explain what I meant by all these things. The last thing here is our updated diagram then. So we have our Solr master server that's doing all our indexing. It's connected to our ILS. And we have our Solr slaves, which are replicating from our Solr master. And they're serving content to VuFind, and therefore serving content to the user. Now, unfortunately, the weak part of this is the ILS, because it's, in this case, it's not, highly available. And that's going to be based on which ILS you have and whether or not it's capable of such things. So there are a lot of different ways to accommodate these same kinds of setups. Solr Cloud I hope to revisit soon and maybe correct my former mistakes, see what I did wrong, and maybe get a better understanding of it, write some documentation, and sort of help with that. So lastly, I guess I wanted to touch on server configuration, specifically for Solr, about performance, telling when things are wrong. And I'm just glossing over this. I wanted to do a little bit more, but didn't have quite the time enough to prepare for this. But basically, when it comes down to troubleshooting the Solr index, it's either a hardware or a software problem, or then you can also consider an external issue. And what I mean by that is either your hardware isn't giving it enough resources, or your software is not giving the JVM enough resources, you're not configuring it with enough resources to deal with, or it needs a different garbage collection profile, that sort of thing. And this is like a rabbit hole, so I really don't even want to get too far into it, because Java is a complex beast in and of itself, especially when it's run with a servlet container and set up with all this sort of things. But then the other thing is it could be an external issue. I know for a fact that Google and Baidu just love to crawl over our search results in VuFind and take down our indices. And so that it's very important to set up a correct robots.txt file which tells the search engines which way to go, whether or not they should index a particular area or not. So there's been a lot of discussion about that on the mailing list I've seen, so there's a lot to glean there. And I'm hoping that maybe if I find some time, I can write some documentation based on that, and we can all sort of collaborate on that particular point. Lastly, one of the best ways to tell the capacity of your VuFind instance is to actually use JMeter to test it. How do you know when it's going to crash unless you crash it yourself with as much force as possible? JMeter is a nice little utility that lets you set up some connection parameters, lets you run, in this case, a number of queries at once, and you can see how many it takes to take down your server, and you can work with people at your team to see how long it takes for your server to crash or how much it can handle, and you can also identify weak points. So in this configuration, I imagine if I suddenly flooded my VuFind server with a bunch of commands, I have 2 Solr servers just ready to serve up anything. They're both ready to just give it everything it's got. And they've both been allocated with a lot of hardware resources, and they've been set appropriately in the JVM to utilize those resources. The ILS, on the other hand, is just a single database connection with something that may or may not have enough connections open for the level of testing I might do. So in this case, perhaps the ILS might fail first, but you won't know that until you try. So this is sort of the joys of working with VuFind and the ILS integrations in the Solr server. So that's all I have, so I guess it's time for questions.
Is this drawing accurate in terms of these are each individual virtual machines, or your VuFind, your web server is only doing VuFind, there's not also a Solr instance running on that machine?
There are a number of different ways you can configure it, but in this case, that would be correct, that they're separated out. Just because I wanted to be able to nail down which issues are happening where, our VuFind installation itself is running without a Solr instance on it. It's just sitting there serving PHP and web files, and it's just performing the lookups both to the Solr indices and the ILS. So the Solr slaves are each their own individual servers, and the Solr master is itself an individual server.
And they're all virtual machines?
In this case, they are all virtual machines. Things get a little bit more hairy when you have to deal with hardware itself. So you have to sort of decide which setup is appropriate for your instance. Another thing I didn't really talk about much was with Solr is sharding, so that's something to consider too if you need to split up your index across multiple servers and sort of deal with the load that way. So, anybody else?
Hi, I'm Ed from the National Library of Finland.
Hello.
And it was really interesting to hear and see what you've done. Did you write any documentation? Did I miss or did you write any documentation on how you configure VuFind for the local configurations and everything?
There is a
Version 1, so it's not important for us yet, but we are coming.
Yeah, there's a little bit of documentation about the multi-backend driver and how it is involved with indexing your records for this kind of configuration. But overall, the documentation is lacking, and I'm hoping to have some time here soon to sort of sit down and write all this out. I mean, it's clearly all on paper here, so I have to at least copy and paste something, so it's useful for other people here. So.
Another thing is that we moved to Solr Cloud last week because I like to live dangerously.
That's exciting.
So if you have any experiences or want to hear mine, so please ask.
Yeah, I might have some questions for you later. Excellent.
Todd Olson, University of Chicago. A couple questions. Are you using authorities in your VuFind instances?
Not in this case. We're not actually importing authority records. We're
Okay.
more or less offloading all of that to the ILS in terms of looking up what's where. And to be honest, the current implementation at the Keystone Library Network is somewhere between a public beta and semi-production. As I mentioned, the State Library of Pennsylvania is using it for everything, but not all the features are configured. We're still working through all the motions of making sure that we can get everything working for everybody, and we have things working in dev that we don't have in prod. So that's sort of the situation there.
Okay. Then the other question is, and this might be premature, but do you find yourself having to ever do a complete re-index from scratch? And if so, what's your strategy for propagating those indexes?
In this case, actually, because we're using a highly available setup, what we could actually do, and what I would do, and it's kind of a little bit kludgy, but I would actually block access to the Solr master from the slaves, and I would leave the slave Solr servers up and just serving content. And then what I would do is I would actually, after I was assured that they could not reach the Solr master at all, I would empty out the index on the Solr master, and I would re-index all the data. And then after that, I would feel comfortable, as long as I didn't completely remove everything, as long as I ran a delete all and a commit and just did everything cleanly like that way, I would reopen that connection to the Solr slaves, probably one at a time. The first server I would probably take out of the available pool while it's re-indexing and figuring itself out. But after it's full and up and tested appropriately, I would re-add it to the pool and pull the other one from the proxy pool there. So that would be a strategy for doing that.
You mean you would shut off the port access?
These are Linux machines, so I would probably just set an IP tables rule, or I would probably just comment out the rule that actually allows access to the Solr servers. One of the things I guess I should mention while I'm up here is that you never, ever want to let your Solr index be available directly to anybody. Port 8080, which is the default for Solr, you can do some pretty nasty things to somebody's Solr index if they leave that open, so you only want to limit access to the servers and the areas that actually need access, administrative access. So in this case, I would actually just block the ports with IP tables, a firewall. So.
Sort of along those lines, since you mentioned something about ports and certain containers, do you see any reason to prefer either Jetty or Tomcat?
I'm probably a little bit more familiar with using Tomcat, although I kind of cheat most times and end up using HAProxy in front of it for things whenever I have to deal with SSL configurations. Honestly, because Jetty is default, and Jetty is what most of the people in the community seem to understand and support, I don't really see any reason to migrate. But we do, at Shippensburg University and at the Keystone Library Network, we do host some different products that use Tomcat instead. Because we're a Red Hat sort of oriented group of folks, we sort of like doing just yum install Tomcat 6 and just moving on. But because Jetty's included by default and it just works, there's no real reason, at least in my eyes, to change it. So.
You mentioned that you found that you had to do direct indexing to get good performance. Have you tried parallel indexing over HTTP to see if that gets you better results?
I thought that was what we tried originally, and then we were having some issues there, but it very well could be a configuration issue. It could be a keyboard and chair issue between that. So I'd be more than happy to maybe inquire about that a little bit and make sure that we're getting the best performance we can, because certainly if records could update faster and index faster, that would be desirable.
It definitely makes sense that direct writing is going to be faster if you have just one set of records and one indexing process, but I think HTTP lets you spread out the workload more widely. So depending on how your updates come in, it might be worth looking at.
Yeah, we've been running them sort of just to make sure we get everything. We run those semi-hourly updates with an inclusion period of like the last day, just in case for whatever reason the servers would be down for 2 days and we didn't want to lose all that information and have to go in and customize the scripts again, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think I'll have to revisit that among a number of things. So.
What kind of performance are you actually seeing?
For indexing?
Yeah.
I honestly don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I think it was small hundreds of records per second, something like that.
10 and 60 are on the same scale. Because I find it a little bit slow, but it's like 100 to 500 per second for us.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So I'll have to investigate the parallel.
I'll also mention that I know Jonathan Rokekind is working on a new Mark to Solr indexing tool in JRuby, I think, that is in no way compatible with SolarMark, but if you're looking for a new toy to play with,
Okay.
and I can find the name of that if you're interested.
Sounds fun. Okay.
You need HAProxy in order to do the failover?
The reason for having HAProxy is essentially just to handle redirecting where to go for an individual query. So it's essentially our load balancer. And if somebody had configured Solr Cloud correctly, me, then it would probably do the same thing and be work very well in that respect. So HAProxy is there to basically delegate where to send queries.
Do you index anything outside ILS, like e-content or third-party stuff?
I think right now we're limited to what's in the ILS. I think some people are indexing e-content inside Voyager, so we're getting it sort of that way, but we're not actually doing anything external to Voyager at this time. So we probably would like to, but we'll see.